An eerie silence seems to descend upon the monitors at the Pacific Geoscience Centre in Sydney, British Columbia, before the needles move. They don't just move, they saturate. It is 9:17 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on March 18, 2026, and what Canadian seismologists are witnessing in the deep data is changing everything they understood about Pacific tectonics. This is not the gradual, millennia-long accumulation of stress standard textbooks describe. This is happening in real time. The numbers are diverging from every established predictive model at a terrifying velocity. Scientists at Natural Resources Canada, who have spent entire careers preparing for the big one along the Cascadia subduction zone, are staring at displays showing unprecedented anomaly clusters. They are beginning to whisper a word they have never used publicly, a word that signals a categorical shift from mitigation to unavoidable catastrophe, unsurvivable. What is organizing right now beneath the surface of the Canadian Pacific is unlike any seismic precursor event in recorded history. Three massive, distinct geological systems are converging simultaneously, and the critical alignment is occurring directly beneath the Strait of Georgia, anchoring the most densely populated corridor in Western Canada. But here is the data point that has the nation's top geophysicists in complete professional panic. This is not an impending earthquake, defined simply as a release of energy. This is a geophysical sentence. Hi, I'm Daniel, and this is Natural Disasters. Today we are analyzing the imminent geological collapse forming beneath Canadian soil. Let me explain the mechanics of what is happening under Vancouver and Victoria right now, because the interplay of forces is genuinely terrifying. The National Seismograph Network is struggling to interpret a signal that has no clean historical analog. The system relies on three separate, coupled engines aligning, and the clock on that alignment is rapidly running down. The first component is the Cascadia Megathrust itself. The Juan de Fuca plate, typically converging with the North American plate at a steady few centimeters a year, has completely locked along a 200-kilometer segment just west of Vancouver Island. But this isn't standard locking. NRCan's network of continuous GNSS stations, placed along the rugged coastline from Tofino to Portardi, usually record a westward elastic bulge as the continent compresses. Since 4 a.m. this morning, that signal has flipped. The coast isn't bulging, it's rapidly subsiding at a rate of 15 millimeters per hour. To visualize this, imagine the entire coastline as a stressed diving board that has suddenly cracked, not snapped, and is now sagging uncontrollably toward the abyss. This unprecedented localized strain rate suggests that the megathrust interface isn't just sticking, it's actively tearing. It is pulling the Canadian landmass down with it before the final catastrophic slip occurs. To understand the scale of the impending disaster, we have to look at the timeline of the last 48 hours, where the data stops being statistical noise and starts being a siren. At 4:12 a.m. on March 17, 2026, the Geological Survey of Canada's borehole strain meters, located on the Saanich Peninsula, some of the most sensitive instruments in the world, recorded a sudden, violent contraction of the rock mass. This wasn't a tremor. It was a 12-centimeter lateral offset of the bedrock itself, occurring in less than 4 minutes without a corresponding earthquake magnitude. This is what geologists call a silent slip, but at a velocity and magnitude that has never been documented in the Canadian Cordillera. By 6:45 a.m., the Pacific Geoscience Centre in Sydney began receiving automated alerts from the Neptune Underwater Observatory. High-precision pressure sensors on the seafloor of the Cascadia Basin, 200 kilometers off the coast of Vancouver Island, indicated that the ocean floor was rising. The Juan de Fuca plate is no longer diving smoothly beneath us. It is buckling upward, forced by a massive, deep-seated blockage that scientists are calling the Vancouver Knot. This blockage has caused the lithosphere to warp like a sheet of plywood under too much weight. The second geophysical engine, and the one that is truly unprecedented, is the deep slab brittle failure. At 8:30 a.m. today, March 18, 2026, seismographs located a focus at a depth of 15 kilometers directly beneath the Strait of Georgia, near the community of Nanaimo. The data is haunting. Harmonic tremors, typically associated with the movement of magma or pressurized fluids in volcanic belts like Mount Meager or the Garibaldi volcanic belt, are being detected here, where no active volcano should be. Instead, Natural Resources Canada scientists believe they are witnessing the literal dewatering and structural melting of the subducting plate due to frictional heat that has exceeded all theoretical limits. Dr. Sarah Akonjo, a senior research seismologist with the Geological Survey of Canada, described the readings in an internal briefing to Public Safety Canada just hours ago. The seismic velocity through the Georgia Basin has dropped by 30% in a matter of hours. This suggests the rock is no longer behaving as a coherent solid. We are looking at a state of total structural dissolution of the upper crustal layer. The ground isn't just going to shake, it's going to lose its ability to support the weight of the cities above it. The third and perhaps most immediate component is the liquefaction engine. This is where the physics of the Earth meets the specific vulnerability of Canadian infrastructure. The Fraser River Delta, which supports the cities of Richmond and Delta and the critical hubs of Surrey, is composed of a massive weak layer of Holocene age silt and sand, over 300 meters thick in some places. Data from the Richmond Seismic Monitoring Network indicates that pore water pressure within this silt layer has reached critical saturation. Because of an unusually heavy spring freshet in the Fraser River and recent extreme tidal surges in the Salish Sea, the groundwater is literally pushing the sand grains apart from the inside. At a monitoring station near the George Massey Tunnel, GNSS data shows the entire delta has shifted 8 centimeters toward the sea in the last 6 hours alone. This is the collision point. The subducting plate is buckling upward, the mid-crustal bedrock is shattering, and the surface sediments of the lower mainland are liquefying simultaneously. When these three engines fully synchronize, the energy release will not be measured in seconds, but in minutes of sustained, violent displacement. Engineers at the Port of Vancouver and Vancouver International Airport are already seeing the precursors. At 9:52 a.m., Terminal 1 at YVR reported unexplained floor heave of nearly 10 centimeters, enough to crack the reinforced concrete of the primary runway. The Roberts Bank Superport, Canada's critical gateway for Pacific trade, has recorded a sudden 15-centimeter drop in the sea dike elevation. This is not a slow process. It is a structural collapse occurring in real time. Public Safety Canada has reportedly moved to Level 4 imminent catastrophe status, a designation usually reserved for national existential threats. The timing of this convergence is what has the scientists losing sleep. If the crust shatters during the peak of the incoming high tide, the dikes protecting Richmond, already weakened by internal liquefaction, will not simply leak, they will vanish. This isn't just a seismic event, it's the dismantling of British Columbia's foundation. To understand why the current data is so terrifying, we have to look back at the scars already etched into the Canadian landscape. The atmosphere of the scientific community right now is one of grim recognition, because the Geological Survey of Canada has spent decades studying the ghost forests of the Pacific coast, mute witnesses to the last time this engine fully ignited. On January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 p.m., the Cascadia subduction zone ruptured in its entirety. Oral traditions from the Nuu-chah-nulth and Coast Salish peoples describe a night where the ocean vanished, only to return as a wall of water that erased entire villages from the west coast of Vancouver Island. We know from sediment core samples taken from the Effingham Inlet that the subsidence was instantaneous. The land dropped by nearly 2 meters in seconds. But that was a standard megathrust event. What is forming in April 2026 is a coupled systemic failure that makes 1700 look like a localized tremor. The 1946 Vancouver Island earthquake, a magnitude 7.3 centered near Forbidden Plateau, provides a chilling baseline for what happens when the crust beneath British Columbia is even slightly disturbed. That event caused the bottom of Deep Bay to drop by 25 meters and triggered underwater landslides that snapped communication cables across the Strait of Georgia. Now, imagine that energy scaled up by a factor of 1000. NRCan's current open Quake hazard models, which ingest real-time data from the Canadian National Seismograph Network, are no longer producing standard probability curves. They are producing clipped results, meaning the projected energy release is literally off the charts, used for building code resilience in Vancouver and Victoria. But there is a specific historical anomaly that scientists are now revisiting with newfound dread: the 1929 Grand Banks event. While that occurred in the Atlantic, its mechanism, a massive submarine landslide triggering a catastrophic tsunami, is the exact coupling effect now detected on the continental slope of Tofino. GSC's high-resolution bathymetry shows a 40-kilometer-long tension crack forming in the sediment pile of the Cascadia Basin. This is the Pacific Arctic feed. As the Juan de Fuca plate buckles, it is destabilizing massive reservoirs of methane clathrates, frozen gas trapped in the seafloor. If that weak layer of the continental shelf fails, it won't just be an earthquake. It will be the largest mass wasting event in Canadian history, displacing a volume of water that will turn the Salish Sea into a hydraulic trap. The numbers coming out of the University of British Columbia's Earthquake Engineering Research Facility are staggering. They have been running simulations on the Vancouver Knot blockage. Their findings suggest that the 326-year silence since the 1700 event hasn't just been a period of dormancy, it has been a period of anomalous strengthening. The knot has acted as a tectonic welt. When a welt breaks, it doesn't just slip, it shatters. The recurrence interval for Cascadia is often cited as 500 years, but the high-end frequency data suggests a window of 250 to 800 years. We are currently 326 years into that cycle. The physics are clear. The spring is fully compressed, and the latch is failing. What has scientists in a complete panic is the triple-point synchronization. Traditionally, we view the megathrust, the crustal faults like the Devil's Mountain fault, and the deep slab stressors as independent variables. But the March 18th data confirms they are now locked in a feedback loop. As the deep slab melts and dewaters, the steam pressure is lubricating the crustal faults above it. This is why we are seeing simultaneous swarms near Abbotsford, Nanaimo, and Victoria. It is a cascading system failure where one disaster triggers the next in a millisecond fast chain reaction. Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, has also noted a terrifying twist. The atmospheric pressure drop from an intense low-pressure system currently sitting over the Gulf of Alaska is actually contributing to the lithospheric flexure. The weight of the ocean is changing just enough to pull the trigger on a crust already at its breaking point. Statistics from Public Safety Canada's Scenario 1A are now being leaked to regional health authorities in the Lower Mainland. The forecast model doesn't talk about damage to individual buildings, it talks about the permanent loss of geography. The model predicts that the Richmond and Delta floodplains, home to over 300,000 Canadians, could see a permanent relative sea level rise of 3 meters due to co-seismic subsidence. This isn't a flood you can pump out, it is the ocean claiming the land. And for the first time, geologists are seeing harmonic resonance in the bedrock of the North Shore Mountains. The very granite that supports the bridges across the Burrard Inlet is vibrating at a frequency that suggests the underlying tectonic plate is tearing itself apart. The historical precedent isn't 1700 anymore. We are entering a geological epoch for which there is no human record, only the cold, hard certainty of the data currently screaming from the monitors at Sydney. The data on a screen is cold, but the reality on the ground is a visceral, heart-stopping terror. To understand the human stakes of the April 2026 collapse, you have to look past the seismic traces and into the eyes of the people currently standing in the crosshairs. Dr. Elena Moretti, a senior analyst at the Geological Survey of Canada, has spent the last 72 hours in a windowless room in Sydney, watching the Vancouver Knot begin to splinter. At 10:04 a.m., she performed a task she had practiced in simulations but never believed she would execute. She initiated the Omega protocol, a direct encrypted patch to the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. Her voice, captured on the official NRC transcript, is steady but stripped of all hope. The deformation is no longer elastic, she told the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. The bedrock beneath the Strait of Georgia is behaving like fractured glass. We are no longer looking at a warning window. We are looking at a survival window. You have minutes to authorize the emergency broadcast before the fiber optic trunks across the Fraser River are severed by the first lateral spreads. In the city of Richmond, the geography of the disaster is already manifesting in terrifying, quiet ways. Ananya Singh, a 34-year-old civil engineer who lives in a mid-rise near the Lansdowne Canada Line station, noticed the first sign of the liquefaction engine at 10:12 a.m. It wasn't a shake, it was a sound, a low, rhythmic thrumming coming from the pipes in her building. When she looked out her window, she didn't see fire or smoke. She saw the pavement of number 3 road beginning to weep. Grey, silty water was geysering through the cracks in the asphalt, a phenomenon known as sand boils. Within minutes, the heavy concrete light poles began to tilt at impossible angles as the ground beneath them turned into a viscous soup. This is the nightmare of the Fraser Delta. The land doesn't just move, it ceases to be solid. Public Safety Canada's evacuation models for Richmond and Delta have always assumed a lead time of hours. But with the bridges, the Knight Street, the Oak Street, and the Alex Fraser, all reporting structural instability due to the shifting of their massive pier foundations in the liquefying silt, over 200,000 people are effectively trapped on an island that is sinking into the Salish Sea. On the water, the scale of the triple-point synchronization is even more cinematic. Marc-André Tremblay, a veteran captain for BC Ferries, was navigating the Queen of New Westminster through the active pass at 10:18 a.m. when the sonar alarms began to scream. The depth sounder, which should have read 60 meters, suddenly registered 10, then 5, then flashed an error. The seafloor wasn't rising. The water was being displaced by a massive, deep-seated pressure pulse from the buckling Juan de Fuca plate below. The sea didn't wave, Tremblay later recounted in a simulated emergency debrief. It boiled. Huge, smooth domes of water pushed up from the depths, smelling of ancient methane and rotten eggs. We saw a pod of orcas thrashing in the foam before they were simply swallowed by a massive whirlpool that opened as the crustal fold beneath the pass unzipped. The economic and logistical fallout is calculated in numbers that the Canadian Treasury is not prepared to handle. The Port of Vancouver, which handles over $200 billion in trade annually, is the engine of the Canadian economy. At 10:25 a.m., the Roberts Bank Superport suffered a catastrophic quay wall failure. The massive cranes designed to withstand standard gales were pulled into the Pacific as the reclaimed land they sat upon underwent total liquefaction. Early estimates from insurance adjusters at Lloyd's of London and the Insurance Bureau of Canada suggest the total damage to British Columbia's infrastructure will exceed 150 billion Canadian dollars in the first hour alone. This isn't just a regional crisis, it is a total freezing of the Canadian supply chain. The Trans-Canada Highway at the Jackass Mountain section and the Coquihalla Highway have already been hit by precursor rockfalls, effectively severing the lower mainland from the rest of the country. Metro Vancouver is no longer a connected metropolis. It is a series of isolated, sinking archipelagos. The power grid, managed by BC Hydro, is the next domino to fall. The massive transmission lines that bring hydroelectric power from the Peace River dams in the north pass through the cascading zone of the Fraser Canyon. As the harmonic tremors from the Vancouver Knot trigger massive landslides in the canyon, the towers are being snapped like toothpicks. At 10:31 a.m., the lights across the lower mainland didn't just flicker, they died. And with the power went the telecoms. The underwater fiber optic cables that link Vancouver Island to the mainland, already stressed by the seafloor deformation, have reached their breaking point. Victoria is now digitally dark. The only communication remaining is the high-frequency radio of the Canadian Coast Guard and the desperate automated pings of emergency beacons. Ecologically, the disaster is a Generation Zero event. The Great Barrier Rainforest and the delicate estuaries of the Vancouver Island coastline are being hit by the initial displacement surges. As the land subsides, the saltwater intrusion into the Fraser River is pushing kilometers inland, poisoning the spawning grounds of the sockeye salmon, the lifeblood of the coastal ecosystem and First Nations communities. In the village of Tofino, the 10:40 a.m. retreat of the tide was so extreme that the seafloor was exposed for nearly a kilometer out to sea. The residents, trained by generations of oral history and modern drills, are fleeing for the high ground of the Pacific Rim National Park, but the data suggests the incoming surge will overtop the very ridges they are climbing. The physics of the Pacific Arctic feed means this water isn't just coming from the horizon. It is being pushed by a localized, massive displacement of the continental shelf. The scale is unbearable. This is the moment where the data ends and the struggle for national survival begins. The clock isn't just ticking, it has run out. The 2026 event was not the end of the story. It was the prologue to a fundamentally different Canada. As we look into the years 2027 and 2028, the data flowing into the offices of Natural Resources Canada in Ottawa is painting a picture of a continent in the throes of a great adjustment. The massive energy release in the Pacific didn't just dissipate, it moved. Geophysicists are now tracking a phenomenon known as Coulomb stress transfer on a continental scale. When the Juan de Fuca plate finally buckled and the Vancouver Knot shattered, the sudden redistribution of mass altered the gravitational and rotational stresses on the entire Canadian landmass. The stable Cretan, the ancient, frozen heart of the Canadian Shield, is showing signs of tectonic awakening that haven't been seen since the retreat of the glaciers. The most immediate and terrifying future risk is the eastern response. At the University of Toronto's Department of Earth Sciences, researchers have detected a significant increase in microseismic activity along the western Quebec seismic zone and the Charlevoix seismic zone in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Dr. Simon Lefebvre, a specialist in intraplate seismicity, issued a briefing to the Quebec provincial government, stating that the unzipping of the west coast has effectively reloaded the ancient faults beneath Montreal and Quebec City. The St. Lawrence corridor, which houses nearly 25% of the Canadian population, sits on a series of failed rift faults buried under deep layers of Lida clay, a sensitive marine clay notorious for spontaneous massive landslides. If a magnitude 6.5 or 7.0 event were to trigger in the Charlevoix zone as a response to the Pacific shift, the Lida clay would liquefy just as the Fraser Delta did, but this time beneath the industrial heart of the nation. The port of Montreal, the refineries of the East End, and the critical rail bridges across the St. Lawrence are all built on this geological house of cards. Meanwhile, in the north, the Arctic feed is accelerating. The sudden crustal flexure of 2026 has triggered a thermal pulse in the permafrost layers of the Mackenzie River Delta and the Beaufort Sea Shelf. Natural Resources Canada's permafrost monitoring stations near Tuktoyaktuk are recording ground temperatures rising at 3 times the projected rate. This isn't just about melting ice, it's about structural integrity. As the permafrost thaws, it releases trapped methane clathrates, the same wick layer gas that destabilized the Cascadia shelf. The result is a series of thermokarst collapses that are literally swallowing sections of the Dempster Highway and the critical pipelines that supply energy to the interior. The Arctic is no longer a frozen barrier. It has become a fluid, unpredictable frontier where the ground can vanish in a single season. The logistical future of the country is equally precarious. With the port of Vancouver effectively offline, the burden of Canadian trade has shifted entirely to the port of Prince Rupert. But Prince Rupert sits directly adjacent to the Queen Charlotte Fault, Canada's version of the San Andreas. GSC data shows that the stress transferred north from the 2026 rupture has increased the slip deficit on the Queen Charlotte Fault by 40%. We are essentially funneling the entire nation's economic lifeblood through a single port that is now the most tectonically stressed point on the planet. Engineers are racing to harden the facilities at Ridley Island and the Fairview Terminal, but the math is unforgiving. A major rupture on the Queen Charlotte Fault would not only destroy the port, but trigger a trans-Pacific surge that would devastate the newly rebuilt communities on Vancouver Island. In the hallways of the Geological Survey of Canada, the mood is one of stoic observation. They are no longer asking if the next system will fail, but where the stress will migrate next. The 2026 verdict has revealed that our national infrastructure, our highways, our power grids, our cities, was built during a tectonic lull that has now officially ended. We are living in a period of high-frequency readjustment. This means that the building codes of 2020 are already obsolete. The 1 in 500-year flood or earthquake is now a 1 in 25-year probability. The insurance industry in Canada is already reacting. Premiums in the St. Lawrence Valley and the BC interior have surged by 400%, creating a geographic insolvency, where entire regions are becoming uninsurable. This is the reality of the data. The Earth does not care about our budgets, our election cycles, or our 5-year plans. It obeys the cold hard laws of physics, the movement of magma, the friction of plates, and the inevitable release of accumulated strain. The most dangerous storm wasn't in the atmosphere. It was beneath our feet. And while the initial shock of 2026 has passed, the crust is still settling. The needles on the seismographs in Sydney and Ottawa are still moving. The pressure is still building. And the next chapter of the Canadian story is being written in the deep, silent language of the rock. Stay informed. Understand the ground beneath you. Follow the data, because the data is the only thing that won't lie to you when the ground begins to speak. This is Natural Disasters. I'm Daniel, and we are all living on the other side of the verdict now.